Welcome to your Module 7 lecture. In this module, of course, we're exploring the creation of the US Constitution, as well as what historians call the early republic, politics in that early republic, the first decades of this new United States. Your work for this module includes this lecture's exit exam, as well as a pretty beefy activity where you're going to engage with some of the courses of the Montpelier organization. So let's jump into this part, the lecture. And we're going to explore Shays' Rebellion as a precipitating factor to the creation of the Constitution. Then we're going to understand early political divisions, the first political parties, and then politics after Washington, including the Adams presidency and the election of 1800. What was the situation first? Where do we start in 1781 in the midst of the Revolutionary War? The government is guided by the Articles of Confederation. What were the Articles of Confederation? Well, they're a wartime document, and that's really clear when you look at what does the Articles, or what do the Articles give Congress the authority to do? So this wartime document created in 1781 is not the creation of a strong federal government at all. The states' constitutions are still prioritized here. This is instead a league of friendship, a way to keep the states together through Congress. But Congress doesn't have a lot of power. Now, we have a one-house Congress here, so there's no upper house and no presidency, no office of the presidency in the Articles of Confederation. What could this Congress do? Could declare war, it's a wartime document, conduct foreign affairs, make treaties. If we think about what's missing here, it already might be jumping out at you that, like, wait a second, can Congress raise money? Can Congress create taxes? No. Again, the Congress does not have a lot of power here. Most of that power belongs to the states in the Articles of Confederation. One more thing Congress could do is control land to the west, what they called the Northwest. It's up here in that Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region, this region that colonists, remember, believed they were fighting the French over during the French Indian War. They believed that they were fighting to control this land, to push Native Americans off this land and control it for themselves. So in the middle of the Revolutionary War, Congress says, yep, we're taking that land and we're going to control it. After 1784 and the Land Ordinance then of 1784, Congress is tasked with dividing this land up into districts and selling these plots. Now, you know there's people on this land. In our next module, we're going to explore the policies of Indian removal that start really early to push Native Americans off of that land. And if you look down here, it shows you a little slice of Ohio into the details of townships and into the plots that Congress is selling. Congress sells this land for $1 an acre. That's an absolute boon. That is enormously cheap. Land is cheap if Congress will seize it for you and sell it to you. But even though it's $1 an acre, you need $640 to buy a plot of land from Congress. So this is not the boon for middling farmers that you might expect. This is a boon for colonial elites who are able to buy this land and resell it at a profit. All right, so that's what the Articles of Confederation is up to. How do we get from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution? What events led to American leaders like Washington pushing for a stronger federal government? Most of the states, I don't know why I said most there, the states like the Articles of Confederation. It gives them more power. Most American elites think this is plenty, this is good enough. Washington says this is good enough. We don't need a stronger federal government. Some, like Alexander Hamilton, are already pushing, we need a stronger federal government, in part to protect property. Washington's like, I'm not so sure about that. In 1786 and into the early spring of 1787, Hamilton is trying to organize, get support for a constitutional convention. He's advocating for a stronger federal government. And the question that everyone asks Hamilton is, well, is Washington going to be there? Does Washington support this? Hamilton says, oh yeah, no, definitely. Washington's absolutely going to be there. But Washington has no intention of showing up to the Constitutional Convention. Something happens in the winter of 86 and into the spring of 87. Something happens to help change Washington's mind, to help him or encourage him to think, you know what, we do need a stronger federal government to protect property and to put down continuing unrest as all of this rabble, all these regular folk continue to advocate for what they think the revolution is all about. That event is Shays' Rebellion. Okay. The heart of Shays' Rebellion is this ongoing debate over economic liberty. Is it free trade or is it older traditional customs? Shays' Rebellion is an outpouring of anger and frustration of farmers in Western Massachusetts. And this is going to lead to an armed uprising named after Daniel Shays. It should be Shays S apostrophe. Daniel Shays is a farmer. He doesn't actually start the revolution. He just ends up getting a lot of credit / blame for the rebellion. So let's talk about what's happening among these farmers in Western Massachusetts that has them so upset. This is not a primary source. I cannot attest that anyone actually threw a tax collector into the river. What's happening in Western Massachusetts? So we're talking about over here. We got our Western Massachusetts farmers over here. Over in Boston, you got your working class people, think about dock workers, but you also have a lot of elites and the governor. All right, the governor's friends, all right, are over here in Boston. So here's the situation for farmers in Western PA. Most of these farmers fought in either the state militia during the Revolutionary War or they fought in the Continental Army. When they were mustered out, they were not paid. Congress had no money, states are broke. Officers were paid. Enlisted men were not. What they got instead was an IOU, a bond. That's what a bond is. It's an IOU. A bond from Congress or a bond from the state, depending on where they served, that said, we know we owe you money for your service. We will pay you back. In 86, 87, during and after the revolution, economies are in crisis in these states. These farmers can't count on Congress or the state ever having money. They're not sure that they're ever going to get paid. So what they do is they sell those bonds for pennies on the dollar to people that can afford to roll the dice. They sell those bonds, to simplify here, to wealthy people in Boston. Now there's wealthy people elsewhere as well that they're selling them to. So they sell them to wealthy Massachusetts merchants and bankers who buy them for pennies on the dollar. Now, farmers in part need to get that influx of cash because they're dealing with deflation. Let me explain to you. You know inflation. Every year prices get a little bit higher. Every year money's worth a little bit less. We're very familiar with inflation. What Massachusetts and many of the states are dealing with is deflation. Let's use a modern example. A car that costs $20,000 today costs $10,000 next week. You're like, I love it. I love deflation. I'm going to go buy myself a half-price car. No, deflation is a sign of an economy in crisis. This also means that your boss is going to call you up and say, by the way, I can only pay you half of your salary. And what it meant for farmers was that when they borrowed money from the bank, they put up as collateral and as a way to pay back the cash that they got, they could pay that back in kind, which meant, for example, they could come back and pay that cash back in the form of a cow. This is an older traditional model that says banks have to accept any kind of repayment. Even if they want cash, the traditional model says farmers can pay back a cow. By 86 and 87, what farmers are encountering is, one, banks will no longer accept in-kind repayment. They go to the bank with a cow and the banker's like, what am I supposed to do with a cow? Do you see how many cows I have? No one can afford to buy them. I want cash. And they're finding that the courts, instead of siding with the farmers as they expect, are siding with the banks. Here's another problem. When they borrowed $50, they promised to pay back a cow. A cow is $50, right? When they show up at the end of the year to pay back that $50 with a cow, the banker says, A, I have too many cows, and B, cows don't cost $50 anymore. They cost $25. You owe me 2 cows. From a farmer's perspective, how on earth has the value of a cow changed over the course of a year? It's the same animal. It provides the same function. Deflation has dropped those prices, and what we see by 86 is farmers in Western Massachusetts in crisis. Taxes are very high. They're losing their farms. They're being foreclosed on and being evicted. But wait, why are taxes so high? You remember those bonds that farmers sold for pennies on the dollar to wealthy people in Massachusetts? Those wealthy people are friends with the governor, who's also wealthy. You remember the Massachusetts Constitution? You have to be really, really wealthy to be the governor. His wealthy friends encourage him to pass higher taxes to pay back the state bonds, not to the original holders, but to the current holders. So these farmers in Western Massachusetts who sold their bonds to wealthy people over here are now being taxed higher than they ever were under the British, specifically to pay back the bonds that they sold, which would be a boon to the people that currently hold them. The farmers rebel. They say, absolutely not. We don't want to pay higher taxes so you can pay back money to the people we sold our bonds to. They say, look, you want to pay those bonds back? Pay them back to us. We'll pay back the pennies on the dollar. That's fair. We'll give back the money that we took for them, but we want those bonds paid back to us. What do our merchants and bankers and wealthy Bostonians say? They say, that's the free market, baby. No one pressured you to sell us those bonds. We didn't steal them from you. You sold them of your own free will, and we have a right to make a profit off of them. Farmers say, absolutely not. We have a right to be protected, and we expect the courts to protect us. And when they don't, the farmers shut the courts down. They literally seize the courts in these towns, prevent them from enforcing debt, prevent them from foreclosing on farms. The judges, by the way, hilariously have to move to the tavern next door, and they're like, court's out of session for the year. Not for any particular reason, we're just done. And then they all go home. What does the governor do? He calls out the militia. He says, we have to put down this uprising. I'm going to call out the state militia to deal with this. What's the problem? The farmers are like, state militia's already here. It's us. We're the state militia. The governor ends up hiring a private army. His wealthy friends give him the money to do this because, after all, what are they going to get out of this? All that bond money that they bought for pennies on the dollar. They help to raise money for a private army, mostly made up of working class folk over here in the port city who don't have property, who aren't necessarily aligned with the same desires of the farmers that just need a job. So this is the forces that clash in Springfield in 1787. You see here that they clash at the Federal Armory. The farmers have gone there to seize arms. This is a secondary source depicting the Shayshites being gunned down by this private army. As you look at this as a secondary source and the argument this secondary source is making, this may remind you of Paul Revere's depiction of the Bloody Massacre. We see the same depiction of this very organized army fighting on or firing on a less organized, patriots here. The fact of the matter is the Shayshites were experienced soldiers. They were probably more experienced than the army that the governor raised. But this secondary source suggests to you that people were very sympathetic with the Shayshites. I forgot his name, John Hancock, who became the next Massachusetts governor, pardoned all of them. People love John Hancock. John Hancock's one of the more radical revolutionaries. He pardons them all. There's a lot of sympathy for this. Wait a second, we're firing on our own farmers in our state. So ultimately, this is the takeaway for most people in Massachusetts. But Shays' Rebellion also encourages Washington to look at this situation, to see that the governor almost lost control of his state, to see that the property of those wealthy Bostonians and Massachusetts folk, their property, those bonds were at threats. What's going to happen next? Washington says, you know what, we need a stronger federal government to protect these property rights, but also to make sure that these rebellions stop. For the Shayshites, they're saying, look, we just fought a war against unjust taxes. We're going to keep fighting against unjust taxes. Washington says, no, it's over. Go home. Your responsibility in American politics is over. Go home. Vote for your betters when it's time to do so. So in 1787, a delegation met in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution. You're going to dig deeper into that with your Montpelier activity. And this is really being steered by people with the desire for a strong federal government, including Hamilton and Madison, who believes that we need federal authority to protect private property. Now, you might be a little bit confused. You're like, wait a second, didn't Madison also write the Bill of Rights because he was concerned with a too powerful central government? Yes. By 1791, Madison, depicted here, baby-faced Madison has become an anti-federalist by 1791, largely because of his opposition to Hamilton. Okay. So if Hamilton and Madison are there in 87 because they want a stronger federal government, who shows up to say, no, we don't want a stronger federal government? Or who is outside the Constitution saying, no, a stronger federal government is not what's needed? Well, state politicians. State politicians are like, we're fine with most of the power being in the hands of the state. Small farmers just saw what happened with Shays' Rebellion and are like, no, thank you to a stronger federal government. There's a few abolitionists, white abolitionists, I should say, including the Quakers in Pennsylvania. They say, no, we're worried that slavery is going to get enshrined in that Constitution. And they're right. People worried about centralized power, people worried about favoring creditors, people that you owe money to, instead of the people that are in debt. Again, that's the central issue of the Shays' Rebellion as well. These anti-federalists will come to demand that Bill of Rights that James Madison will author. But James Madison also says, look, the Bill of Rights is great, but it's a piece of paper. When the federal government decides to impose on your rights, what is a piece of paper going to do to prevent that? So he says, look, the Bill of Rights is great, but it's going to fail us at the moment that it is most needed. You're going to dig more into the office of the presidency, but just a bird's eye view of the Constitution. You know, it created 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, judiciary. So legislative is Congress, executive, the office of the presidency, the judiciary, think about the Supreme Court. It was a compromise that led to the formation of these 2 houses. In the Senate, each state has 2 representatives. Of course, the House of Representatives is apportioned by state population. Washington calls the Senate the cooling saucer. So think about a saucer and hot tea. House of Representatives is that hot tea. The saucer is what's going to catch some of it before it spills on you. The upper house is meant to cool the House of Representatives down. You know that in 2020, that's where all the bottleneck happens when it comes to legislation. Okay, at first, senators were chosen by state legislatures. You know that's not how it is anymore. We choose state senators by popular election. And of course, they had indirect elections for president and vice president, which meant that people elected specific electors, like you knew who you were electing to elect the president. Now we still have the Electoral College. You know that people still show up to their state houses to vote the way that their state guided them to, but you can't name, I would be shocked if you could name more than one or two of your state's electors. That's not how we think about it anymore. In the original Constitution, you were directly electing people who would elect the president on your behalf. Okay. The Constitution created the first two parties right away. You get the Federalists, the Whigs on one side, and the Democratic Republicans emerge on the other. Don't get too attached. Again, you can look for the threads, the connections to our own contemporary parties, but it's not going to be nice and neat. It's going to be much more messy than you would expect. So don't spend too much energy trying to figure out which one are the Democrats and which one are the Republicans. Doesn't quite track like that. What were the major divisions between these two parties? The Federalists supported Washington. They supported a strong federal government. They support Hamilton's economic program, which in part would take all state debt, Congress, the federal government would take on all of the state war debt, pay back those bonds, for instance. The Federalists were eager to become friends with Britain again. Let's ally with Britain, it's good for trade. And they are allied, united with Britain in opposition to the French Revolution. The Federalists were not as interested in democracy as the Democratic Republicans. If you're a fan of the musical Hamilton, I love it as a musical. As a historian, The thing that the musical gets wrong is that Hamilton was really into the idea of democracy. He was not. He still believed in that small r republicanism and deference, that people should show up to vote for their betters and then go home. And only certain people should vote, for instance, people that own property. Democratic Republicans like Jefferson and Madison, on the other hand, supported the French Revolution, did not want to create a close alliance with Great Britain, the country they just fought, did not support Hamilton's program. It did not prioritize Southern economic needs, and they believed in broader democratic participation. However, that idea of broader democratic participation did not include it, or there was an obvious caveat that it didn't include enslaved people. Most of the Democratic Republican leadership were Southern slave owners, but it's not a North-South divide just quite yet. At their heart, Federalists don't trust what they see as the mob. This cartoon depicts Mother Mob here on her breasts. You probably can't read. It says whiskey and rum, nursing infant liberty. Federalists say, no way. This is all the people that we relied on during the Revolution to work on committees of safety, to make sure their neighbors were patriotic, to fight in the war. We don't really trust them. We don't really trust the government in their hands. You could see here a little imp. These got the various books of law on fire, fanning it with the Constitution. Little girl here is like, yeah, should we put the baby infant liberty right into the fire? In the back, this will be odd. It's the storming of the Bastille, the moment in the French Revolution when the Bastille was stormed. The Bastille conveniently had both political prisoners and arms in it. So it was a one-stop shop for French revolutionaries. They're associating this American mob with French revolutionaries. So this is a good cartoon if you want to think about the Federalist perspective. This is what the musical Hamilton gets wrong. Musical Hamilton is not talking about how Mother Mob is going to take over and destroy the country. Both musical Hamilton and real Hamilton have this economic program that we discussed, creating a new national debt, creating a new bank, taxing whiskey to raise money, and creating tariffs and government support for domestic manufacture. This is probably apparently to you not Adam Smith's free trade, which Jefferson and Madison are more interested in. This is a highly interventionist economy. All right. How does Hamilton's plan get passed? Hold on, I just ate a bunch of ice. Jefferson and Madison oppose it, but they agree to support it in exchange for Hamilton's support to move the capital into the South. This is going to geographically put the capital right into the heart of the slave power, those elite planters like Jefferson and Madison themselves. They also believe that if you separate the geographical political center from the geographical economic center, which is Boston, New York, Philly at this point, that'll separate money from politics. That hasn't worked out so well. So this is the bargain where Hamilton's plan gets passed. Okay, I want to keep moving. What about that whiskey tax I talked about? What the heck was that about? A tax on whiskey is actually a tax on Western farmers. Western farmers, we're talking near the Appalachians, that's the West at this time. Western farmers use whiskey as a currency. It's a shelf-stable commodity that they trade among themselves as a currency. So an excise tax on whiskey is really going to affect those Western farmers. We know what Western farmers do when they face undue taxes. They rebel. It happened again in Pennsylvania in 1794. Backcountry Pennsylvania farmers tried to block the collection of that tax. So again, they seized the tax collector, they seized the courts to try and block that. And they got out all of their old revolutionary stuff. These are, again, men who fought in militias and the Continental Army. They're like, get out the liberty or death banner. Come on, we got more taxes to fight. For them, this is still the revolution. This is the same ideas that inspired their, not complicity, but their participation in the revolution. They're ready to keep it going. We don't want to pay higher taxes now under the United States than we did under Britain. Washington says, nope, time to go home. Washington marches on Pennsylvania. This is the only time that we have a sitting president who actually leads an American force into battle. Again, he's president when he does this, and he's leading them against other Americans, against Pennsylvania farmers. He does not have to go all the way to Western PA. They hear that Washington is coming and they're like, nope, put the banner away. It's over for us. So Washington sees Shays' rebellion and says, we're going to need a stronger federal government. Whiskey tax is like, yep. He's like, I was right. We have to put down this type of continual rebellion. What about after Washington? Washington is reelected unanimously in unanimously, double check me on that. It's not in my notes. He's reelected in 1792, but then in 1796, he decides that he has to step down. There's no law that presidents can only run or have two terms during this time. You probably know that FDR won the presidency 4 times. He died in office in his 4th term, and then we changed the laws. But Washington says, no, we need to set an example that the presidency is not for life. That you don't get to be president for life. I'm going to step down and make way for my vice president, Jefferson, to run for office. Jefferson runs for office, but is defeated by Adams. Now, here's the weirdest part of these these early elections. The vice president is the runner-up. So just close your eyes and imagine from 2016 to 2020, an administration with Donald Trump as president and Hillary Clinton as vice president. We probably wouldn't have been able to tear our eyes away from the news, as every day Hillary Clinton, the vice president, and President Donald Trump snipe at each other, right? You could imagine how bad that would be. And that's what the Adams presidency was. Adams' biggest critic, his most vocal critic, is his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. And there is plenty to criticize. Adams is politically extremely intelligent. He's a great political philosopher and not a good president. He's paranoid. He has a thin skin. He overreacts. He deals with the same stuff that Washington does, but he doesn't deal with it as well. And the biggest crisis of, it's not even a crisis, it's self-made, but the biggest crisis, and it's a constitutional crisis during the Adams presidency, is the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. Adams is upset that the press prints critical things about him. That's it. The press is critical of Adams, and Adams doesn't like it. And being a newspaper editor is one of the ways that you enter politics. So some of the newspapers that are criticizing Adams are owned by congressmen like Matthew Lyons. Matthew Lyons is an immigrant, and he's a newspaper editor, and he's a congressman. The Alien and Sedition Act is aimed at people like him. It's aimed at making it more difficult to become a naturalized citizen and easier to deport people like Matthew Lyons. It also, the Sedition Act makes criticism of the government unlawful, potentially seditious. So Adams passes a law that says you can't be critical of me. Thomas Jefferson calls this a reign of witches. He says this is blatantly unconstitutional, blatantly in opposition of the First Amendment. And here we have one of the many fights that, a representation of one of the many fights in Congress that breaks out over this. This is politics in the age of passion, after all. And this turns, I mean, Adams is already unpopular. Even his supporters don't really like Adams, but this is going to mostly demolish his chances for a second term in 1800. So let's talk about the election of 1800. And you probably know, again, if you're a Hamilton fan or just a fan of dueling in history, you know that one of the things that the election of 1800 would ultimately lead to is the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr that resulted in Alexander Hamilton's death. How do we get there? Well, let's rewind. Election of 1800. Jefferson, Adams's vice president, is running against him. And he's running with Aaron Burr as his running mate. Remember, the runner-up gets to be vice president. How do you deal with this? How do you create a situation where you're going to have a president and a VP that actually can work together and actually like each other? Now, if you're a Hamilton fan, you might also be confused right now because you're going to say, wait a second, I thought the election of 1800 was between Jefferson and Burr. What are you talking about? It's really messy. So if you're a Hamilton fan, you understand the election of 1800 between Jefferson and Burr, but it doesn't start that way. Remember that the runner-up is VP. Here's the situation. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr are running together. One of the reasons Jefferson chooses Burr is because he's going to bring in support from New York. John Adams has picked a new person that he wants to be his vice president, Charles Pinckney. So Adams and Charles Pinckney are running together. There are 138 electors. Each of them get 2 votes. Both of the votes are for president. How then do you end up, if you're a John Adams supporter, how do you try and create a situation where John Adams gets the most votes overall and Pinckney gets to be runner-up? For right now, let's focus only on this part. I'm going to try and do some, nope, that's the wrong thing. Oh, I tried to do some magic over here on my PowerPoint. Nope, I'm doing a terrible job. I'm going to stop. All right. Wait, let me try one more thing. Nope, over it. Okay, so we're just going to focus on this part. This is the tally of electoral votes. Let's imagine that John Adams and Pinckney have the most support. Here's what their electors do. Everyone gives equal votes. Adams, Pinckney, Adams, Pinckney, Adams, Pinckney, Adams, Pinckney. One person from Rhode Island takes their vote for Pinckney and throws it away to John Jay. What you have down here then is 65 votes for Adams, 64 votes for Pinckney. If they were the popular ticket, that would end up with an Adams presidency and a Pinckney vice presidency, but they're not the popular ticket. Jefferson and Burr are. So let's see what happened over here. Their electors You see a lot of support in the South, less support in the North, but importantly, that support from New York, which is absolutely necessary. New York and Virginia and Massachusetts have the most electoral votes. Okay, so Jefferson and Burr, 1 and 1. Every elector is giving 1 vote to Jefferson, 1 vote for Burr. Jefferson, Burr. Someone was supposed to throw a single Burr vote away to John Jay or whoever, and they didn't do it. So what you have is a constitutional crisis. Adams and Pinckney are out. They lost. They have 65 and 64 votes. What you have is Jefferson with 73 votes, Burr with 73 votes. Constitutional crisis. This is not supposed to happen. Think about it. The Constitution is written for an ideal country that has no parties. In an ideal country that has no parties, it makes perfect sense. Best person gets to be president, second best person gets to be vice president. That makes beautiful sense in a political system without parties. Parties demolish the whole thing. All right, so what do? This constitutional crisis throws the election to a contingent election in the House of Representatives. Now the House of Representatives are going to decide who is president. Jefferson and Burr begin campaigning directly to the House of Representatives, trying to get them to vote for them. Burr was planning to be Jefferson's vice president, but all of a sudden he's like, wait a second, I could be president. And he starts campaigning to the members of Congress and the House of Representatives. This election goes on, by the way, from October 31st to December 3rd. It takes a while. They vote multiple times. The House of Representatives cannot decide who to vote for. The entire thing almost falls apart here in 1800. What happens, what tips the favor towards Jefferson is that Alexander Hamilton, never a fan of Jefferson, he comes in and he says, I'm supporting Jefferson. He throws his support behind Jefferson. House of Representatives vote Jefferson number 1, Aaron Burr number 2. And then, of course, the 12th Amendment changes that. So we no longer vote in this absurd way. 12th Amendment makes sure that this never happens again. Runner-ups. So we don't choose vice president just from the runner-up anymore. All right. That's all. Let's end there. Thank you for listening. As always, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next module.